Thank you very much for being here, first of all, and for having me here. I have to confess that I'm a little bit overwhelmed by the quality of the presentations because I don't have any PPT or anything of the kind. So I'm going to give you a break on that, in that respect. Basically, what I want to do is to tell you a few things about what I have learned in my experience as a researcher who has been involved in policymaking processes in Latin America for many years. And what I'm going to say is relatively simple, I think, and it's not based on any, not related to any particular institution or any particular program or project or whatever. So it's just the gist of the experiences that I have gathered over several years. And the question that I try to answer is, what is the way that knowledge influences policy, which is what we are talking about here. And I think that the first important consideration in this respect is to be very aware that research is just one of many influences in the policymaking process, which, among other things, implies that impact is very difficult to measure. And we have to be very humble on that, because very, very seldom do we know for sure that we have had an influence on anything. It's the way it is, because policymaking process is a complicated process where many people from many walks of life, institutions of different types, prejudices and whatever. Everything influences the policymaking process. And we are just one little more influence in that little process. So we have to be aware of that, and we have to be humble. The second consideration is that the development, the policymaking process in developing countries is very different to that in developed countries. And this is something that is easy to forget, even for people like myself or my colleagues or my postdocs, when I had those at the Inter-American Development Bank, who were Latin Americans, for instance, but who had been formed in the US or in the UK. They completely forgot about the context, probably because they never had any contact with the context, with the institutional context in their own countries, and they learn everything from the universities in the US and in the UK. And the policymaking process are very different in the developing countries. First of all, because they are not fully democratic, which means that there is corruption, that many people don't have voice. We heard a lot about this in the previous panel. Because interest groups have a lot of influence, and that influence sometimes is very opaque, doesn't occur in a clear way. So there are many informal instances to which interest groups can influence the policymaking process that you are not aware of, you cannot really affect. So that's one aspect in which the policymaking process in developing countries is different. The other one, which has been mentioned by many of the previous panelists, is that the government capabilities are low. The government capabilities are not the same, obviously, as in developed countries, and that includes the fact that turnover is very high, something that has been mentioned several times, that there are no technical teams, because most of the times you don't have contact with the minister or with the head of the, institute of whatever, health. But no, most of the times the way our knowledge operates is through influence in a technical team that has access to the minister or has access to some influential politicians that can influence some aspects of a law that is being discussed in Congress or whatever. So and if you do not have this intermediary or these teams, it's very difficult to have that knowledge has influence, because ministers don't have time. And probably you don't even understand the language they speak. I don't mean Spanish or English, I mean the language in practical terms. I mean, they have a different frequency. And you can never synchronize that frequency to talk with them. So most of the times, not all the times, but most of the times. So low capabilities is also a problem. And there is, in many developing countries, that there is a lack of what I would call intermediary institutions, the institutions that sort of bridge the gap between we outsiders and those who made the decisions and operationalize them. And those intermediary institutions are basically think tanks, communities of practice, journalists who understand what they are talking about. Because, yeah, I mean, very seldom, very often you find yourself in front of a microphone, but you know that the person who is asking the question has no clue of what that person is asking. I mean that's so common. So obviously, in that case, you cannot use that channel to influence the policymaking process, and that's extremely common. So we also have to be aware of that when dealing with the development, with the policymaking process in developing countries. Also, the processes in developing countries are very, very much short-sighted than in the developed world, because the political situation is always more fluid, more unstable. Political parties are not well structured, governments change very fast, and so on and so forth. So that also affects the way knowledge may influence policy. And sometimes even when you have the opposite situation, I mean, when you have sometimes governments or ministries that have relatively good capabilities, and there are the intermediate institutions and all that, all of them may be easily captured by fashion or best practices. Let's call them best practices. Sounds very serious. But fashion is an enemy of good thinking and serious thought about development problems. And that happens very easily. And unfortunately, some of the things that are promoted by the World Bank or even by the IDB, where I work, it's just promoting fashion. I mean, just try to be higher up in the ranking of whatever. And sometimes policymakers don't even understand what that means. Don't pay a penny about the substance of that, but they want to appear higher in the ranking of whatever. And that's being slaves of fashion. And that's very common. And many of the big reforms that were done in Latin America were done out of fashion, not out of thinking. Pension reforms, to mention one. Just fashion. Because the idea of the Chilean system was very well advertised in all of Latin America. So many countries follow without enough thinking. And I have to say that I was partly involved in that process, and I seriously regret to having participated in that sort of fashion and that contest. I have been talking about policymaking processes, and I think that something that is really important is that you as researchers, postdocs, and your researchers make serious effort to understand the policymaking process of the country or the city where you are working. Because most of the times what happens is that you haven't thought about the policymaking process, and in the effort to try to influence the policymaking, you discover constraints, and you discover things that you hadn't thought before. You say, oh my goodness, the person who made this decision is this. Oh no, but this has a lot of influence. Oh, this guy is corrupt. And it's better if you think that, to the extent that is possible, if you consider those things first. And here are my very general clues about that. In thinking about the policymaking process, you should try to take into consideration or map 4 things. One is the stakeholders. What is the list of important stakeholders? That's something that has been mentioned several times today. And by that, you mean government instances, be them local or national. You also mean the intermediary institutions that I have mentioned, like think tanks, journalists, and so on, community organizations, and so on and so forth. So try to think of those institutions that are important in the policymaking process, which are, well, some of them may not be institutions, but the stakeholders. So that would be the first aspect. The second one is try to think about or discover or inquire about the arenas where they interact. Because it's easier to think that the decision processes take place in formal arenas, but most times, especially in developing countries, they don't take place in informal arenas. Formal arenas are a formality. Sometimes the Congress is complete formality. I mean, that's not where things are discussed. Things are discussed and negotiated in other places, and then once agreements have been reached, you think that there was a discussion, that there is a discussion in Congress. There is no discussion in Congress. Things have been negotiated in advance. So understanding these things, I think, is important to have some influence. The third is how the actual process of decision is made. What instances, formal and informal, take place. And the fourth one is what are the instruments that you want to change. If you're talking about, let me put a simple example. If you want to influence the fiscal situation of the country, well, what are the instruments? Well, the different tax ratios and the tax exceptions and the different lines of expenditure and so on. So what are the, obviously it's much more difficult in social programs and in interventions that are more sophisticated and more refined, but you have to think what are the instruments that are available to policymakers to operate, to handle in order to change results. So I would say some tips or some warnings about trying to influence the policy-making process. First of all, there is no best practice, unfortunately or fortunately. And as has been mentioned by several panelists before, influence is more about process than product. So, and that means that you have to be engaged and you have to develop relations with all the key stakeholders, and you need to create trust. Because if you create trust, you may not succeed the first time, but you may succeed the second time. So, I mean, so it's all about the process, and process requires understanding these aspects of the policy-making process that I have mentioned. And partly because what you want is to affect the results, many times the most important contribution to something, to changing the world, is changing the policy-making process. I mean, and I like Gina's presentation a lot about that, because what she's saying is we need to give voice to a group that hasn't had voice. Once you have done that, then you are empowering them and you have changed the policy-making process. That's a beautiful example of what I would say in a more abstract way, but it's exactly that. I mean, and that's what you want to do. That's what you want to do. Not necessarily to have a direct impact and then say, okay, yeah, I completed this. I can get my money back or my new round of funds for my research. No, unfortunately, that's not a good way to go, and it's much more important to think how you can influence the policy-making process so that in the end, the ideas, not only your own ideas, but other ideas can influence that process in a better way. Something else that I would say is that timing is of the essence in influencing the policy-making process. Timing is everything, as Niv mentioned yesterday when we were having dinner. Timing is everything. And in order to take advantage of the opportunities that are all most of the times very narrow, the windows of opportunity are very, very narrow, you have to be prepared. So you don't know when you may be able to influence, but you have to be prepared. As Louis Pasteur says, fortune favors the prepared mind. And that's essential in the business of influencing the policymaking, the policymaking and getting results. And finally, I would say that communication is very important. That communication have to be tailored to the context. That's something that is very important, and that's, I think, why people who are not locals or who are not familiar enough with the situation in the country should team up with somebody who is, because everything is context, and communication is very important, but you have to contextualize your knowledge and put it in a way that is interesting and appealing and looks opportune to those who make the decisions. So that would be, thank you.